Great.
My email is
Okay, I think we'll get started. So I'm Claire Chambers from the University of York, from the English department, and this is part of the Hope series that my colleague Indrajit Roy has been the project leader for. It's been a really exciting series and it's ongoing. We do have lots more talks coming up, so follow our social media, etc. In terms of today's structure, I'm obviously going to give Annie Zaidi a short introduction, and then she's going to read to us, and I'll tell you a bit more about that in a bit. And then we'll go into an in-conversation, the two of us, for I imagine that the reading and our in-conversation will take us up to 1:45, around that time. And then the last 15 minutes of what will be about an hour's talk will be taken up with your questions. So be thinking what you'd like to ask Annie. We don't mind how you do that. You can type them in the chat if you like, or you can turn cameras on and address them to Annie, whatever you want to do. So without further ado, I think I'll introduce Annie, because I'm absolutely delighted that she's able to be with us today. She was saying that she is in the UK, so I thought it was only right that we grabbed her to do a talk at York as early as possible into the PhD that I'm sure she'll tell you more about. So Annie Zaidi is the author of City of Incident, a novel in 12 parts, of Bread, Cement, Cactus, a memoir of belonging and dislocation, of Prelude to a Riot, Gulab, Love Stories number 1 to 14, Known Turf, Bantering with Bandits and Other True Tales, and the editor of Unbound, 2000 Years of Indian Women's Writing. She is the recipient of the 9 Dots Prize from 2019 and the Hindu Playwright Award 2018 for her play Untitled 1. Her work has appeared in various anthologies and literary journals, including Griffith Review, Aleph Review, Massachusetts Review, the Charles River Journal, and The Missing Slate. More personally, the two of us were introduced by another writer from the Hope series of talks, an earlier presenter, Tabish Khair. He emailed to connect us in May 2020 at the height of the world's first COVID lockdowns. And I must say that getting to know you, Annie, at this horrible time has been one of the few hopeful things for me, along with learning Hindi, which we were talking about earlier. So I'd now like to hand over to Annie, who will read her piece, 7 Notes on Hope, which was written especially for our Hope Consortium. We're very lucky for that. So Annie, thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this talk series, and it's been wonderful meeting you both online and offline, Claire. I'll just read out this experimental piece I've written. It's I'm calling it 7 Notes on Hope. One, if it is a thing with feathers calling through chill lands, perhaps it has a curved beak and talons. It cannot be a snowflake, a bird of prey surely, sharp-eyed hawk looking far into the distance, swooping when the moment is right, swallowing little mice. A scavenging thing perhaps, living off that which cannot weather the sore storm. On land it seeks small mammals, on strange seas, fish. A feathered thing that can poach from bears and mountain lions, strong, fierce in the knowledge that every desert has snakes and lizards and every lake has toads. Every posh enclave has a garden where lunching ladies eat ham and cucumber sandwiches. The magpie ability to grab, to sneak into alien nests to conserve her future. A crow is also a bird after all. 2. The crow no longer hunted, no longer roamed the land, no longer could. Once land was reserved for them, once they were locked down on land. Jonathan Lear writes of philosophical injury and the question, How should we live when, if, after of the exhaustion of history? Chief Plentycoop spoke of feeling hearts and the cessation of song, uncanny sense of menace, Lear writes of things ceasing to happen. If this is a possibility, it is a possibility we must all live with. They weren't crow, you know. They were children of a large-beaked bird, fighting or preparing to fight. Catastrophe. Not just loss from one point of view, but loss of the point of view. Lear writes, unthinkable things happened. But they did not happen just once. Names, races, colors blur into perpetrators, numbers, scalps, feathers and caps. The nature of injury, depth, scale is the work of anthropologists, historians, statisticians, philosophers. What it comes to is this: nobody really starts over. They start from wherever they were paused. We cannot understand hope unless we understand the catastrophe. Smallpox, cholera, 1,000 Sioux warriors, the fight taken out of the crow. Rebecca Solnit writes, hope isn't a lottery. Rebecca Solnit writes, hope isn't a lottery ticket, but it is a gamble. Also an axe. Slow, plodding work then. Step forward, slide back. Step, step, slide, step, 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 slide. My grandfather wrote, hope as the flaming torch of disappointment after disappointment, a lonely tree on a highway. 4. Who wants to be the lone tree on a road frequented only by passers-by? Better the tree under which a bench has been installed, where picnics can be imagined. But that is not the tree of hope. That is the tree of joy, of solace, of justice and showers of light and yellow, pink petals in spring. It grows. The well-traveled have seen it, stopped a minute under it, conceived of egg sandwiches and lukewarm tea in flasks. My grandfather wrote disappointment, dipped in the syrup of nostalgia, baked it into the assurances of 4,000-year-old civilizations, of the screams of widows buried under millennial dust. He wrote of goblets going chana chen chen, smashed high spirits, poems with words like talkh, tariqi, tanha, a whole ghazal with tanha as the radif. Tree on highway, man in crowd, face in the mirror, trusting eyes of childhood, looking upon the venue for murder and boyhood games. Tanha, a lifetime, tanha. How do I spend this dark night alone? He asked, then answered, go humming a couplet from a ghazal, for the road to love is long and you must travel, tanha. But live, he also wrote, live your life, for that's what life is meant for. So what if it is parched and bitter and too short? What if it is? What if the evening of sorrow is long? Fez wrote, between evening and dawn comes a dark, dark night, and the dawn, when it comes, may be flecked with soot or blood. 5. Is hope cloven from despair? The poets knew better than to cleave night from day, patience from drat it all, damn you. Faraz wrote of the last light waiting. Faraz wrote of the last light waiting only to be put out. Fani Badayuni wrote dialogue. Despair says to death, do your job. Hope says wait. My letter will surely be answered. Baba Farid addressed his sorry. Baba Farid addressed a scavenging bird. Crow, eat up my whole body. Don't eat my 2 eyes. They're still waiting for my beloved. Springing eternal, this feathered thing picks at, gouges out thick veins of despair, like medieval doctors bleeding patients to cure them. Nusrat sings, whose words? कोई देखे तो किस कश्मकश में है बीमार उल्फत है उनका, आज ही मौत है आने वाली, आज ही वो भी हैं आने वाले. Oh, look at the dilemma of the one made sick by love. The beloved is expected today, but so is death. Poets know better than to cleave despair from hope, love from sickness, desire from the terror of a fire that can't be put out. A river of fire, yes, but better drowned than dry. 6. Death comes, change comes. Has either ever failed? One may hope against either, but to what avail? Flying in through an open window, tunneling through snow, walking through the night. Hope is an outlaw sitting in a cell thinking better this than. Incarcerated words sometimes turn into butterflies. From invisible cells emerge all the things we understand. Solnit writes of mushrooms after rain, of an underground network of fungus, from dark and hidden places, from margins and edges where hope properly lives. A gift, she says, a power, embrace of the unknowable, but alive in the premise of we don't know what will happen, but therefore it is important to say what hope is not a diet pill with guarantees, not a wall to claw at, not even a door, but you know, doors exist. For all our peculiar vulnerabilities, for all the special unnamed cruelties and impotent rage, if only we are willing to face this pain, something good may emerge. Lear writes, I have not wanted to foreclose on human hopefulness. The crow would send young boys off to dream for meaning. Chasing an elusive dream, Chief Plenty Coops would chopped off his own finger when he was a boy of 10. He saw the lodges of countless bird people were in the forest when the 4 winds charged it. Only one is left unharmed, the lodge of the chickadee person. The wise chickadee listens, learns, believes in the great power of little things. Chief Coops kept his own counsel. 4 war eagles sitting along a trail of blood, unspeaking, he described. But of the golden eagle that visited, he said nothing. Those who knew, knew. The crow survived their own death, Lear writes. The sun rises, the sun sets, the sun dance dies, is danced anew. Wait, stay alive in the little things. Hope is dangerous, Solnit writes, but writers are gamblers. My grandfather marveled at humanity, that hope should not shatter though the heart is a cinder. Live, he wrote, it's what life is for. Breathe then, great bird, over horizons the human eye cannot see. Soar, swoop, feast. That's it.
Thank you so much, Annie. And you know I've read this already, but hearing you read it so beautifully is a different experience. And I want to thank you with how you've engaged with the topic so profoundly. And I want to start by asking you about the line which I was really struck by, as you know, hope is an outlaw sitting in a cell, thinking better this than, and then it sort of trails off with an ellipses. So, I mean, let's start there as we talk about hope.
Thanks, Claire. That actually comes from Solnit's book. A lot of what I've written is either inspired by or drawn from these two books. One is Rebecca Solnit's Radical Hope, and the other was, Jonathan Lear's Radical Hope, and Solnit's other book. So there she describes, she uses, there are two images I'm playing with here. The very next line refers to incarceration, and the line before that says hope is an outlaw. I've used the word outlaw. Solnit, I don't think she uses the words outlaw. She's talking about, in her work, she talks a lot about the struggles people have led and the ways in which they actually have also won. It does not seem as if it is possible to win at that moment, but they have won. And this particular section, if I'm not mistaken, is coming from where she's describing environmental, and she describes all kinds of struggles, the feminist struggles, the right for suffrage, etc. Most recently, there are these struggles of small communities, local communities that are fighting for raise climate change awareness, but also fighting against the kind of industrialization and mining and all these initiatives which are really destroying the planet and destroying communities. And she also refers to the Wall Street, kind of Occupy Wall Street that happens, all of these things. And this particular section comes from this guy. He's an activist and he's arrested. And they put him in jail, and she's obviously talked to him, she's interviewed him, and at some point he says that I was sitting there in jail, and obviously it's a huge deal, right, to be arrested and for something that you're trying to do that's right. But when he goes to jail, he thinks that I'd rather be in here, because if this is what it means, if this place, this planet, our system, if this is what it is, that the only way one can stay out of jail is by just pretending that nothing's happening and letting the climate get worse and worse, then I would rather be here, because this is the more positive thing to do, his engagement, his struggle. And I take that image from there, because he's not a criminal, but in that sense, he's an outlaw. I use the word outlaw in the sense of people who do break the law. They are therefore outside of the law, but also with all its positive connotations, because outlaws also were known in their own way to engage positively with society in certain ways, even if they were breaking the law. So I was using that. And then the next, it leads me then directly to the next line, which is from, I read an article about, there are many art in prison initiatives, there's painting, there's theater, there's writing, and the Writers in Prison Project. So there was this article about how to design a book cover for a book that comes out of prison, like what is the appropriate image for a book cover of that sort. And then the editors and the designers finally decided on butterflies, butterflies made out of words. And there is the freedom and the beauty and the power of flight and everything we associate with that, to not be caged down, because butterflies can't be caged down, but they are, in that sense, words that are imprisoned.
Since you've given us those beautiful phrases, this place, this planet, and you've also talked a bit about climate change awareness, I was very struck by your animalization of hope. So obviously you start with, early on you've got Emily Dickinson's Hope is a Thing with Feathers, and you were a little bit worried because by chance you and Tabish Kher had also, you'd both come, thought of this poem, but do very different things with it. And the way you take it is you go much further. You know, you use it as a springboard and you talk about bird people and other animals, and also the tree of hope. So there's a lot of nature there in the poem. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that backdrop to what you were writing about.
I mean, the Dickinson poem is the one that springs immediately to mind, right? It's such a famous poem, and the moment anyone says hope, that's the first thing you think about. And so I was initially thinking of that, but then I thought a little bit longer. And if you really reflect upon it, in Dickinson's poem, she refers to the resilience of hope despite its fragility. It's a small bird, little thing with feathers, and she refers to storms and you know, the iciness around it, but the bird continues to sing. And so that it is powerful in its resilience. But then I also started to think about what kind of bird would it be. In Dickinson's poem, when I read it, it suggests itself as a very small bird and a very one that is at great risk from the elements. But then I thought about it and I started reading about hope and what it actually asks from you. It's not that it doesn't ask anything of you. You know, it's to say that it asks nothing from me. I don't think that that is accurate. Hope demands a lot from you. It demands that you go on. It demands that you continue to do certain things, because if you don't act on those things, then hope itself will fail and die. So moving from there, I began to play with the image of the bird. What kind of bird? And I think if it is the kind of bird that can survive storms, then it needs to be a strong bird. It can't be a little crumb-eating bird. It has to be a powerful bird, capable of fighting, capable of hunting. Because when you have a storm, when you have an adverse climate, when you have, say, famine, the bird of hope must be able to fend for itself. And by itself, I mean, obviously us, we have to be able to fend for ourselves. So I started then thinking of predatory birds. It is much more likely that it is a predatory bird. And I was also thinking of, I spent most of my adult life in cities, big cities, Bombay, Delhi. And when I was little, to mostly urban areas, I remember crows used to come and snatch away at tiffins. You'd be out there eating your lunch, and then this crow or a kite would come and it would take away your whatever bread or sandwiches, jam sandwiches. They would come and take them away. Sometimes they'd steal them, sometimes they'd kind of come swooping down, and then you would get frightened and you'd drop the sandwich and they'd get their hands on it. And I was thinking of that, and I started to think that, you know, birds aren't really, sure, they're fragile, relative, everything is relative, right? But they do have their beaks and their claws, and they can frighten you if they want to. And I have seen this, that in urban environments like Delhi, for example, as the pressure of cities grows, the environment for birds shrinks. They also come looking, and I've seen this happen at, say, the press club in Delhi. There's always kites circling. And if you leave, say, a meat sandwich unattended, they will swoop down and they will try and grab it. So I started to think, then I did a little research about what kind of birds are predatory, what they eat. And I found all these different images from there, because there are birds out there that can sometimes compete with even bears, because it's the same food they like. So, you know, bear is so much bigger, but they will eat those, and they will eat fish wherever they are. They'll look for food, and they will, in that sense, they're hunters. And that took me to the image of the crow, because the crow is, you know, more a scavenger than a hunter, but can attack too. And I was reading Radical Hope, and I was reading Jonathan Lear, and, you know, at the same time, and it was I suppose, serendipitous at that time, because the tribe that Lear is writing about was called the Crow, even though, as I mistakenly, even though, as I've written, they weren't really meant to be the Crow. The French started calling them the Crow because, at first contact, their own name for themselves in their language was that we are children of a large-beaked bird. Now, that large-beaked bird, unlikely that it would be a crow. The French misinterpreted it to mean the crow, but that's what they were called then. From that time onwards, they were called, as a tribe, they were called the Crow. They were nomadic hunting tribe, essentially. Their whole life was fighting wars over territory and hunting. So and then from there, then these two images just carry on.
So since you mentioned your childhood in big cities like Bombay and Delhi, can we take a detour into your memoir, Bread, Cement, Cactus? Because in this book, one of the things that strikes me is how interested you are in the environment. As well as a memoir, it's also really about three places: rural Rajasthan, the courtly former Oudh capital of Lucknow, and the megacity of Mumbai. And at one point you asked, what belongs to whom? What and how much can be taken from nature? Who pays the cost of what is taken and cannot be returned? So how do you start to answer these difficult questions, and what hope do you think there is as regards changing humanity's extractivist approach to nature to avoid an even greater climate catastrophe?
Yeah, my childhood was spent in a strange place. It was neither rural nor urban, but industrial, but in a kind of rustic environment. So, and from there I moved to very big cities. I think as a child, I did not obviously ask such questions. As an adult, I began to, partly not because of nature per se. My interest still remains, and I think broadly the climate conversation remains relevant to us, partly because it's going to boomerang on us. We're not worried about the birds and the bees. We're only worried because we know that our fates are tied to the birds and the bees, that there's no getting away from it. If there was a way, I think, for humanity to continue to extract indefinitely without it kind of, we're worried because we're very close to that point where it can't go on like this. But if it could go on like this, I think most of us would just sit back and say, meh, it's got to go on like this. I worry partly also because as a journalist, I began to look at the human impact, particularly for amongst communities in India that were often displaced by industrial development. And that displacement could be economic. It could be that, that you're a forest dwelling person, somebody's taken away your forest rights or just destroyed the forest itself or started mining, and that is destroying your agriculture, or you're damming up a river and because of that you need to be shoved off. So from there, that was where my engagement started. But if you look at it, once you get talking to people who have lived closely with nature and in nature, and whose dependence on both the land and animals and trees is higher, you also begin to see that what nature gives you is a lot. It's not necessarily symbiotic. It's the people who live in the forest, for example, they consume much less, they take much less, relatively speaking, because of their lifestyle and because development hasn't reached them in the same way. But they also do take from nature, I think one thing that I can find hope in is that the very fact that we are now having this conversation about how much is it okay to extract, what should one extract and when should one stop, 20 years earlier, this wasn't a conversation. When I was a child, when we spoke of displacement, for example, we only spoke of displacement from the perspective of say displacement from the perspective of the people who are being displaced and their rights, and mostly the economic rights. That, okay, you take somebody's land, where is he going to go? How is he going to do his farming? Where is he going to get water for farming? Is the land fertile? Those were the questions that were being asked 20 years ago. The climate conversation was not on the table. It has been put on the table, and it's been put on the table partly through activism, as Solnit points out, that these conversations have taken a very long time to build. Even the left, for example, internationally, the left was not, whether East or West doesn't make a difference. It was not willing to engage with the question of the environment. It was very focused on industrial rights, labor rights, wasn't focused on environmental rights and the damage that occurs and how it affects people. Especially, it affects the vulnerable most of all. But that has become possible now. So I think, one, I see hope in that. The fact that if you worry enough about something, slowly solutions will occur. If we don't even talk about the fact that wind and solar power are alternatives and viable alternatives, then obviously that's not going to happen. But if you keep talking about it, then maybe someone somewhere will do something about it. That is one thing that I do take hope in. The other thing I think that we can take hope in is that I think people are willing to make small sacrifices, and people are willing to change. In fact, there is even an active desire for change, especially amongst the young. There's so much of a vegan movement, for example. Unfortunately, it's not enough. And very often people end up getting bogged down by the littlest thing possible, because they feel that's the only thing that's in their power to do. And perhaps that is not the conversation that we need to have. Perhaps the conversation needs to change so that one can put the industrial scale on which things are done needs to be kind of foregrounded, and individual efforts need to be tied into that, rather than to say, okay, this is the one small thing I'll do, so I'll just use one small plastic bag less, and that'll be my environmental duty. I think one does need to shift the goalpost a little bit more. But the hopeful thing is that there are people out there. I go to the marketplace. Small example, you walk into a Tesco, everything comes packaged in plastic, every little thing. But because we have built a conversation that is anti-plastic bags, everybody brings their own bags. So they'll use that one little bag less. But the problem is that inside that one reusable bag, 50 items are all packaged in plastic, which are non-renewable. So one needs to then shift that conversation from this to that, to say, okay, we are doing this. What are you doing? What are the big guys doing?
Mm-hmm. Shifting back to your piece that you've read to us, let's talk a little bit about form, because it's very much genre defying. And I mean, I guess we talked about it as perhaps a prose poem, but it has sources as well. So you've pointed particularly to Liz and Solnit's books on hope. So I mean, and you were a bit tentative when you sent it to me, but we introduced, and I loved it, as you know. So I wonder if you could talk to us about how, about the form and what I think is very exciting. What would you call it, if anything?
I don't know. This is the first time I've also written something like this. I thought I was writing a prose poem, but it does derive very heavily from the text that I'm referencing, and I do reference as much as possible. But even the images themselves come from, like I explained, the outlaw image and lots of other image, the crow image, all the other images do come from the text themselves. So it is a kind of filtered and understanding of these texts, along with all the other texts that I'm referencing. I suppose broadly one can call it a prose poem, but I don't know if I have a name for it. Yeah, I find that scholarship, if it's a good book and if it's the kind of book that is making you actually think and you can draw connections between them, they often trigger a different kind of writing in a new medium. I mean, I'm finding that quite a bit now in my own work, that I'll read this book and it'll really move me or shake me up. And then I find myself going off to write a poem drawn from an academic text or something like that.
Great. And with your sources, you know, with the Solnit you mentioned about her sort of talking about the environment, also talking about hope when it comes to feminism. And I know that women and gender is something you think about a lot in your work. And it is there, you know, it's hinted at certain moments in the prose poem, like the line about the screams of widows. So I wonder if, you know, having talked about the environment, you could say a little bit about how hope might relate to gender.
Yeah, yeah, I think particularly I'm a little concerned about the rights of women, especially because it seems to me, particularly in our times, that one is taking a step back, that for all the steps forward, that it's always been like that. You know, you take one step forward and you're pushed back half a step, and then you take another step forward and you're pushed back half a step. But recently it seems as if there is a lot of pushback. And I mean, legal rights that have been very hard won are being taken away. More and more one finds that one is being economically disenfranchised, and the guarantees that one thought that one grew up with, my generation of women grew up with, are looking not so solid anymore. And I think that is something extremely worrying. And I mean, that particular image that you refer to comes from this poem my grandfather wrote. It's a long and kind of strange poem, actually. I read it as a child. I've read it multiple times again as a grown-up. It's from Ab ke dhoop kadi hai yaro. That's the poem, which means that this time the sun is kadi. I mean, kadi is hard to translate. It's very, very hot, very strong. When the sun is too strong, that's the word that's used, kadi. You know, it makes you extremely uncomfortable. And in the poem, what he's saying is that we've suffered before. And by we, he's referring to the Indian civilization, really, that the deep roots of the Indian civilization. He begins by talking in a general way about how, you know, we've suffered before, but this time it's really hard. And then he goes on to talk about 4,000 years of our, you know, he talks about Harappa, the Harappan civilization, and also about the world, the global sort of, he talks about the Greek civilization, the Egyptian civilization, and he talks about how it's all buried there under the earth and under the dust of all these centuries. We don't know what stories are buried there, you know, the spirits of people that are screaming. And he mentions widows, particularly, I think widows, partly because I don't know, I can only conjecture. I think he uses widows because a lot of our history is about wars, so much loss. The dead just die, but the widows are left behind screaming. So they deal with the pain of what happens after a catastrophe, after this great thing that has happened. And the memories of, you know, in a way, they're memory keepers, but they also are left holding onto those memories, and that is painful. So he's referring to that pain, that it's a very particular kind of pain. And I think what happens with women is that very often we are literally left holding the pieces. Somebody else makes the decisions and we are left holding the debris, so to speak, of whether it's war. In the old days, it used to be war. Now it is, I think, in a political sphere, we are left holding on to. I mean, if you do look at the climate, some of it also comes from this absolute kind of not just human-centric, but ego-centric approach to the world, right? I want this. Okay, the world is ending, but so what? I still want this. I mean, I don't know whether I should kind of make this about masculinity or a kind of performance of masculinity or whatever it is. I don't know. Maybe that's an unfair thing to do. But the fact remains that women do not get to make decisions. And you look at what's happening in India, for example, the driest and most drought-prone parts of the country, it is the women who spend their whole lives looking for water. Your whole life is just one long search for water. 4 hours a day, 5 hours a day, just carrying water. In parts of Maharashtra, there was even this 1 or 2 villages, the extreme water scarcity. People were starting to marry a second time. Like men, it's illegal, of course, but a lot of men would marry a second time, and these were water wives. You see news reports about them. They were married specifically because you need one more woman to bring more water, because the first wife is getting old or tired or whatever it is, or you just need 2 women to go out there and get water.
As a woman, I'm being harassed. Can you shut the door? Sorry.
Yeah. So I think that, and I think that if women were making more decisions, their view of the world and their rearrangement and reorganization of how a world should be would look different. I mean, if women were not doing this job of fetching water and doing this unpaid work over and over through their whole lives, what would men do? Would they not then have to make different choices? But they don't make those choices because there's, women haven't yet fought that war. Basically, it's a kind of ideological war that they need to fight if they're going to be able to change certain things. So yeah, I am very concerned. In India too, it's quite concerning. There are now laws. Marriage has always been, for example, sexual rights and liberties have always been kind of very, very fragile in the country. For men too, the question of who you will marry remains a very central question in India, and it is hotly and often violently contested. And but the Constitution did at least give you the right, like legal right, to make those choices. But now there is legislation which makes it harder for you if you want to marry outside your community. It makes it harder because the repercussions are worse for you and your partner. Those are the kind of things that I think it's a step back. And the only hope here is that women will know that this is bad for them and that they will fight back. But of course, for that, one has to build that conversation, and one has to build the question of rights and liberties.
Thank you so much. I promised the audience that at 1:45 I would open up for questions. So I've got plenty more, but I invite people to also write in the chat, or so we've got one already from Indrani, which I'll read shortly. So be adding your questions to the chat, or you're very welcome to turn camera on and ask Annie directly. But I'll start with my colleague in Germany and former PhD student and good friend Indrani Karmaka, who writes, "Thank you so much for this beautiful and moving piece. You mentioned Tanha. Could you please talk a little bit more about the relationship between loneliness and hope?"
Yeah, thanks, Indrani. I think I referenced this particular poem because my grandfather has written this poem, and I initially got went back to this poem because of that one line in it. And this line says that उम्मीद कितनी ही मायूसियों की मशाल है, which is that hope is this, mayusi is disappointment, and mashal is torch or flame, and hope is the flame that lights up your disappointment, because you do get disappointed, and you get disappointed over and over in life. But hope is the flame that lights up this disappointment, and obviously doesn't light it up in the sense of setting fire to it. It lights it up in the sense of allowing you to see, allowing you to look past the disappointment. And this is the ghazal in which Tanha was the Radif. So initially I just started with that one line, but then I looked at it and I was like, why is this line about hope in a poem about loneliness? Basically, the whole poem is about different kinds of loneliness, but like in Urdu poetry, each ghazal also is its own, each sher is also its own kind of complete, holds its own complete meaning. And I think perhaps what the poet was trying to say, and in my understanding also, even if we didn't have all these problems that we do have in our lives collectively, even if there was climate change was not an issue, even if, when Emily Dickinson, for example, wrote Hope is a Thing with Feathers, I think she was basically writing about loneliness, wasn't she? Because she wasn't writing about war, she wasn't writing about climate, or she may have been writing about her own personal problems. We don't know what those problems are. But my understanding is that she was writing about loneliness and disappointment, whether it is in love, whether it is in work, whatever it is. And I think hope is necessary partly because it gets you through the small disappointments. Again, like I said, everything is relative, but a disappointment in love, a disappointment in, whatever, your studies, whatever it is, you need it to get past that. But you especially have to keep hope alive, because loneliness is never going to quite go away from anyone's life. You think that it might not be a problem today, but it's going to be a problem tomorrow. It's going to be a problem. Maybe you've just got a really lucky and really full, rich life, but it's going to visit you at some moment. It's going to visit you in your old age. So I think hope and loneliness need to kind of be in conversation with each other, because when the loneliness comes for you, you will need hope in order to make it endurable.
Thank you so much.
We have another question in the chat this is from someone like you, and Annie, that so Varsha Singh is, unless I'm mistaken, this is a colleague from India who's just recently come to the UK, and she says, thank you for sharing your thoughts. What do you do when you come across a word such as dupe? Because it is not just simply a word, it is a metaphor which can have contrary meanings. How does one translate metaphors cross-culturally?
This is something you should ask a translator. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's like summer, Dhoop is difficult to translate, just like the idea of summer is so difficult to translate. Sunshine is such a happy thing in the UK, and you don't understand why until you have spent a winter in the UK. You only understand the meaning of sunshine when you've seen and felt what it's like, the gray skies all the time, and then you understand what it means when Shakespeare says, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? When I was little, we used to laugh about it. We used to read that sonnet. We used to say, like, what is he talking about? Why should anyone compare your beloved to a summer's day? They're ghastly. very few people in India would think of comparing the beloved to a summer's day. It's one of the worst experiences one can have, being out in that kind of heat and sun and discomfort and just sweat and all those things. So certain things are difficult to translate across without also carrying over the context, without explaining the context. It's really difficult. It doesn't translate contextually, especially in poetry. Like in a novel, you might, when you're reading a novel in translation, the culture automatically also is carried over. So one understands that, okay, on a cold and wet day, the sun does mean something. But dhoop is something which is a little more ambiguous, more specifically, since you asked about dhoop. Dhoop has a less, in and of itself, dhoop does not have negative connotations. Lu does. Like in the same poem, for example, my grandfather's poem, he uses this one line. Is it the same poem or another line, another poem somewhere? The line is, लू के थपेड़े खाते खाते शायद हम कुछ थक से गए हैं. It says that, the loo is this hot summer wind that blows across the northern half of the Indian subcontinent particularly. It's the kind of hot wind that will give you a sunstroke or a heat stroke. And he says, thapede khate khate, which means it strikes you like a slap. When it hits you, it's like you've been struck on the face. And there is no ambiguity there. You know that this is a painful experience. With dhoop, in and of itself, it is not painful, which is why when he uses the line, he uses it with a qualifier. He says, apke dhoop kadi hai. If he had not used the word kadi, then one would not have got the sense that, okay, this dhoop, the quality of the dhoop would not have been apparent. Because in India, we also have for example, we say kachi dhoop. Now, kachi dhoop has very pleasant connotations. It means, or some people have also used the word gunguni dhoop, a lukewarm kind of warmth, which is very pleasant, especially in winter, when it is cold, but the sun hits you and you like that kind of dhoop. So I think when you translate it, then you translate it with its qualifiers. In and of itself, it will not make any sense, but with everything else around it, it will make sense.
Fabulous, thank you. That's so interesting for Malin. Yeah. Any other questions?
Hi.
James.
Yeah, I just wanted to say firstly, thank you so much for sharing that piece. It was so eloquent and really immersive and personal, so thank you. But I just wondered, you talked about the form of it, but what was the process behind writing it like? So how long did it take, for example? And also, did you feel any kind of hope while writing it?
Yeah, it took a while. I think it took me about a month. I think, like Claire mentioned, initially I wanted to work with Dickinson's poem, and I thought I'd just do a response to the poem initially, like write a straight prose piece, just reflecting on it and reflecting on the nature of birds and things like that. But then I also began to think about all the other things that I mentioned. And I also was looking for inspiration. Inspiration doesn't obviously come to you very easily, or, as I wanted to write about something meaningful and also to make sense of hope for myself also. So then I started to read these books, Solnit's book and Jonathan Lear's book, both about hope. And I had read an article by Solnit before, and that article was a kind of an updated version for the new edition to her book. And in reading those books, I did feel very hopeful. And because my work is directly responding to it, in that sense, it is hopeful. But the reading really was what? Because, you know, when things are going wrong, we all get, you know, that, oh my God, this is horrible. And it is horrific. There are so many horrific things that happen in the world. And very often our response to it is that we are helpless against it because these are such big things. The forces against you are so large, and you're not going to be able to fight them. You know, you're not going to be able to fight everybody, right? The corporations are too big. There's too much money at stake. Governments are just too powerful, all of those things. So what can you do? And when I read the books, I kind of figured out what the work that has to be done. Everybody has something that is in your power to do. And the underground network of fungus that Solnit talks about, she says that there's so much we don't know about the world. You see one mushroom and you only think, okay, is that edible? Is it not edible? But you don't think about what else is going out there. There is food underground, and it may not be food for you, but it's out there, you know. And similarly, in the book about the Crow tribe, now this was the last chief, so to speak, and the tribe did face a kind of annihilation. But what that book taught me was that what is the nature of annihilation? What does it mean to be wiped out? You know, to be destroyed? What happened actually? The people survived. There weren't a lot of them to begin with, even at this time, that when the tribe was facing its erasure, even then, I think the numbers were very small, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people, because they'd already had smallpox and everything, cholera, all those things had already happened. Now, when you're pushed back against the wall, you have to make a decision. Are you going to keep doing something that is only going to lead in death? Of course, we're all going to die, but you know, death for the whole tribe, in sudden death. Are you going to do that? Or are you going to look for new ways of living? And I think what the Crow did was that they formed alliances with people. Now that we look at it from post-colonial lens, it's very easy to turn around and say, how could he have shaken hands with the white man, etc., etc., you know. But the thing is that all the Native American and the North American tribes, they were fighting with each other. A lot of the reasons for the decimation came because they were fighting each other. And at some point he realized that, okay, we've got to sign these treaties. They're not treaties we want to sign, but if we don't do this, then there's no hope. So sometimes I think you also derive some learning. These are learnings at Hope. Maybe it was one step back, but in that one step back, there was a way of you being able to sort of turn your face in a different direction, and another path will open up. It's not the path you want to take, but it's the only path right now. So take it, just take it. And then 3 steps later, maybe you'll have some way of being able to think back about, okay, so these are the things we have lost. How much of what we have lost is recoverable? That dance we cannot recover, because that dance was a war dance and war is over. But maybe we can learn to dance for different reasons. Maybe we can learn to dance because we just are celebrating the fact that we're still alive. And I think that I learned hope from there.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, James, who's on my module, Muslim Translation of Britain. It's great that you came. Thank you so much, James. Aisha, still, you had your hand up. Aisha is another colleague from India who's now in Britain quite recently. I'm very happy that she's here. So Aisha, over to you. And then I've got Aditi Bale, who I'll introduce in the chat.
Hi, thanks, Claire, and thank you, and for that, fascinating talk. I had loads of questions, but I'll just restrict myself to one. And this was about, the deployment of the prose poem form that you and Claire were just speaking of a few minutes ago. And I was wondering, I mean, this reminded me actually of Rabindranath Tagore's, Goddo Kobita form, which also sort of translates as the prose poem, and in a sense deploys the semiotics of bending the words to pierce the veil of the real, which is the everyday real in conflict with an eternal real. And I was just wondering what might be the implications of the generic form that you employ for, sort of in the prose poem form that you speak of, and what might be its implications for articulating poetics of ecofeminism and climate change, and what might its ramifications then be for women as memory keepers, or for hope as engendering hope for rearrangement and reorganization of the world by women, as you spoke of.
Wow, okay, that's a big question. I'm also very new to doing this, so I think I'm not sure if I have the answer to your question. I do think that one of the things that artists and writers do is I won't say it's a task, because that whatever a task is, it's for each person to figure out what your task in the world is. But I think one of the things that we do instinctively is that we tap into what is going on around us, and we kind of extract a kind of distillate from it. And I think prose poetry is one good way of doing that. Poetry in general also does that, but poetry, one of the I shouldn't use the word disadvantage, but I think from activist point of view, if one is looking at ecofeminism, or whether one is looking at gender politics, etc., I think one of the problems with the kind of poetry that is extremely poetic, where it deploys a lot of metaphors, it deploys a lot of imagery that is often abstract. The problem with dealing with abstractions is that very often your point, the poem itself can be great, and then you can also read that poem and apply it to any context. But what is that context? If that context is not laid out clearly, if it is not apparent to the reader immediately, then in its moment and in the sphere of what one is trying to do, the conversation one is trying to build, perhaps that is not the most effective tool. I think prose poems that way tend to be useful, because prose allows you to flex a little bit, in the sense that you do use imagery, you do use metaphor, but you also just tell a certain story, and you build connections like you would in an essay. You build connections between different ideas. So I think that it offers an opportunity, certainly. I have tried to take that opportunity here. Whether or not one is able to make it meaningful and build an aesthetics around it, I don't know.
Thank you so much.
Let's have a final question from Aditi, who we're hoping to welcome to York in the autumn, who says, thank you for your wonderful piece. I wanted to note how you quote from 12th century Sufi saint Baba Farid's Karga metaphor, which is being asked to spare the lover's eyes. How does that connect with the whole theme of hope? Also, can you talk about the original quote itself by Baba Farid, if I'm citing correctly? So I hadn't picked up on that reference, I must say. Annie, have you got thoughts about that?
Actually, that is something that I also struggle with, partly because I haven't read a lot of Baba Farid. As far as I know, that is a line from Baba Farid. It's been used very often in Hindi films. That's why it's popular, and that's how I heard it also. The original is Kaga Saptan Khayo, Chun Chun Khayo Mas, Done Namat Khayo, Inko or Mohe, Mohe Pia Milan Kias. Some people also mistakenly attribute it to Kabir, but I think this is Baba Farid and not Kabir, if I'm not mistaken. So the Sufi poets, of course, as you know, that the longing in Sufi poetry is a kind of spiritual longing, and death becomes very meaningful because the longing that one expresses for the beloved, if that longing is for the beloved and the beloved is God, then you cannot achieve union until you die. Which is why Sufi poets' birth anniversaries are never celebrated. Their death anniversaries are celebrated. The urs that you celebrate is the death anniversary, because that is when you go to the place where you're supposed to go. That is when the union occurs, the union with God. In that line, what he is saying is, he's telling the crow that, because the crow is a scavenging bird, so he's telling the crow that eat my body when I die. He doesn't spell it out, when I die. So the assumption is that when I die, my body will be consumed by the scavenging animals. Says, when I die, eat my body, leave my two eyes. Now the metaphor of eyes, in the sense that obviously if you're looking forward to a union with God, it is your soul, and the soul has no substance. So the question of eyes or ears is meaningless. But he uses eyes in a poetic way, I think, because he's saying, the next thing he's saying is, Inko Pia Milan ki aas. Aas is hope, where you say, how does it connect with hope? Aas is hope. Aas is another, like ummeed, the word means hope. And it is also a particular kind of hope, which is filled with longing. And he is saying that I have this hope, Pia Milan, which means I have this hope to meet my beloved. And this hope will not leave me even when I die. He says, in that moment of death, my body, my material substance will be destroyed, but my eyes are the things that look out for the beloved. So the image that it is conjuring is a pair of eyes that is sitting there and waiting for the beloved to come, saying that when I die, I'll be waiting to meet my beloved. So don't take away this vision. Don't take away from me this hope that I will be able to meet my beloved. I think, my interpretation.
As you know, my Hindi is pretty elementary, but I want to say Ariva, and how much I've enjoyed listening to you tonight. Annie, it's been absolutely wonderful. I've also really enjoyed the very intelligent questions that have been asked, very suggestive. So I've saved all the chat to ponder it later. So I think, because my teenage boys are hassling me a bit to feed them, I will say a huge thank you to Annie, and we can clap virtually, etc. It's been really wonderful. Thank you so much. And audience, this will go on YouTube, and also we're going to publish this piece so you can read it again and again at your own leisure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I've really enjoyed this. Thanks.
It was great.
Bye.